Vlorë, southern Albania, February 1990. In the streets, gunfire that doesn't stop, and no one in uniform is doing the shooting. A crowd surges toward a government building, and a woman near the front isn't carrying a stone or a gun. She's carrying a passbook, a small paper ledger, filled with numbers she was promised would double, then triple, then keep growing forever. It never occurred to her that the ledger was worthless. Now the building is on fire, and somewhere behind her, a military depot stands with its gates torn open. Weapons are pouring into the street. This isn't a war, a C821 fast race. It's a bank run, with rifles. This is Dead Man's Ledger. To understand what happened in 1997, you have to understand what came before it. For nearly half a century, Albania was sealed shut. Enver Hoxha's regime built over 70,597 bunkers against enemies that never came. Banned private property, banned religion, and banned, in practice, the very idea of a bank account. When communism finally collapsed in 1991 and 1992, Albanians didn't inherit a financial system. They inherited an empty room. No stock exchange, no credit history, no culture of interest rates, mortgages, or investment risk. Into that empty room walked Sali Berisha, a cardiologist turned politician, promising democracy and prosperity in one breath. Albanians believed him. They had no reason not to. They had never been lied to by capitalism before. Only by communism, and communism, at least, had never asked for their savings. Between 1991 and 1996, in the vacuum where banking regulation should have been, informal companies began to appear, offering to hold people's money and pay it back with interest. Not modest interest. Villagers who had spent their entire lives under a state that fixed every wage now heard a number like 30% a month, and had no internal alarm to tell them that was impossible. There was no regulator to tell them either. Albania's post-communist government, still finding its feet, treated these companies less as a threat and more as evidence that its citizens were finally, thrillingly, capitalists. Some economists warned quietly that the math didn't work. Few were listening. The country was too busy getting rich. The biggest of these companies was called Vefa Holding, built by a man named Vb Alamusaj. Vefa was different from the others, and that difference made it more dangerous, not less. It wasn't a pure fiction. It owned real supermarkets, real factories, real shipping interests. A functioning conglomerate that employed thousands of people. When Vefa paid returns, some of that money came from actual profit. That thin layer of legitimacy was enough. If Vefa was real, people reasoned, then surely the smaller schemes, Sud, Safari, Populi, Senage, Silva, were real too. Trust in one gave cover to all the others. Which has it? By 1996, roughly 2 out of every 3 Albanians, some 2 million people out of a population of 3-4 million, with 3-4 had put money into a scheme. They staked more than spare cash. Families sold cows, sold land, sold homes, cashed out pensions and emigrant remittances sent home from relatives working in Greece and Italy. All of it funneled into passbooks promising to double a fortune in a matter of months. Weddings were financed on the promise of future payouts. Houses were half-built, waiting on the next disbursement. At the height of it, in 1996, some schemes advertised monthly returns of 30, 40, even 50%, numbers with no basis in any real economy on Earth. And still, for a while, the money came back exactly as promised. That was the whole trick. It always does, right up until it doesn't. Here is the arithmetic nobody wanted to do out loud. A Ponzi scheme doesn't generate returns. It redistributes them. Every payout to an early investor is simply the deposit of a later one. Moved sideways. It works only as long as new money keeps arriving faster than old money is withdrawn. At 30 to 50% monthly interest, a scheme needs its deposit base to grow at a rate no legitimate economy has ever sustained. Not for a year, not for a decade. Mathematically, collapse isn't a risk. It's a certainty, and the only open question is timing. In a country of 2 million investors, that meant the eventual crash wasn't going to touch a wealthy minority. It was going to touch almost everyone, all at once. The warnings existed. The IMF and foreign economists reportedly cautioned Albanian officials, privately, that the schemes were unsustainable and needed regulation before they grew any larger. Those warnings did not translate into action. Whether that was negligence, incompetence, or something closer to complicity remains disputed to this day. Several officials and party figures were themselves rumored to have ties to the schemes, or simply benefited politically from a population that felt, to Jesuit, for the first time, wealthy. President Berisha's government left the schemes almost entirely unregulated through 1990s, even as some of them began, quietly, to miss payments. A government built on the promise of prosperity had little appetite for telling its people the prosperity was fake. The first cracks appeared in November 1990. Slid and Exafere, two of the larger schemes, froze withdrawals. Investors who had been paid reliably for months suddenly found the office locked, the phone unanswered. Word spread fast in a country where fortunes were now tied together by rumor and kinship. Depositors elsewhere, in Populi, Sinaj, Silva, began quietly asking for their money too, just in case, and that quiet request was itself the beginning of the end. A Ponzi scheme cannot survive a bank run. The moment enough people ask for their money back at once, the entire structure, real businesses or not, runs out of road. Through the end of 1996 and into January 1997, scheme after scheme defaulted. Government officials, including some close to Berisha, continued publicly insisting the situation was under control, even as it plainly was not. For the 2 million Albanians who had invested, this wasn't an abstract market correction. It was their savings, their land sales, their family's future, evaporating in real time with no deposit insurance. No courts able to move fast enough, and often no paperwork beyond a handwritten passbook. Anger needed somewhere to go. It found it in the streets. In January 1997, protests began in Tirana, in Lushnjë, and in Vlorë, peaceful, at first, demanding the government make investors whole. They were not made whole. Through late January and February, the protests hardened into riots. And nowhere more than in Vlorë, in the south, where crowds began attacking government buildings outright. By the end of February, the unrest in Vlorë had escalated sharply, and the state's authority there had effectively stopped functioning. Then came the depots. Between February and March, roughly 657 to a million weapons, rifles, pistols, explosives, were looted from military armories. Stockpiles that Hoxha's paranoid regime had built up over decades against an invasion that never came. Now that arsenal was in the hands of furious, unpaid citizens. On March 2, President Berisha declared a state of emergency. It didn't restore order, it confirmed there wasn't any. Prime Minister Alexander Meksi's government resigned days later, replaced by Bashkim Fino, the mayor of Gjirokastër. X6 Dexter, tasked with an almost impossible job, holding together a country whose southern half had, in practice, stopped answering to Tirana at all. In its place, so-called committees of public salvation formed in southern towns. Local, armed, self-governing bodies operating without the state. For a stretch of weeks, a NATO partner country existed as a patchwork of armed towns. Not because of ethnic conflict or ideology, but because 2 million people had lost their savings and no one had told them why. Amid the chaos, thousands tried to flee. On March 28, a crowded vessel called the Riots, packed with Albanians attempting to reach Italy, sank in the Adriatic after colliding with an Italian Navy ship. Somewhere between 34 and 58 people died. It remains one of the unrest's quietest, saddest chapters. By April, with refugees landing on Italian shores by the tens of thousands, the United Nations authorized a multinational force, Operation Alba, roughly 7,000 troops, led by Italy, alongside Greece, France, Turkey, Romania and others, deployed to stabilize the country. It was called humanitarian, and largely it was. It was also, for Italy, a matter of its own coastline. By the time the mission wound down in August, close to 2,000 Albanians, by some estimates, had died since January. Most were never named in any international headline. By the time Operation Alba withdrew, Albania held an election. On June 29, 1997, the Socialist Party won decisively. Weeks later, on July 23, Sali Berisha resigned as president, replaced by Recep Majdani. VBL Musaj, the founder of Vefa Holding, was eventually arrested and tried for financial crimes. Punishment for the man who ran the most legitimate-looking pyramid in the entire country. Here is what the collapse actually cost. Between $1.2 and $2 billion invested, roughly half of Albania's entire GDP. Around 2 million people, 2/3 of the population, took part. Between 600 force and 1 million weapons were looted from state armories. Many of them never recovered, drifting into arms markets across the region for years afterward. And somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people died in a crisis that began not with a bullet, but with a passbook. Here is the twist this story leaves behind. Enver Hoxha spent decades arming Albania against invaders who never came. It was his own citizens, ruined by a financial fraud his successors failed to stop, who finally emptied his armories. The ledger never balances. Subscribe. Next week, the ledger opens again.